just as sort of kind of an introduction. You understand when we're talking about the development of prayer in a person's life, there are two things going on. One thing has to do with how far this person is involved in prayer, and the other thing has to do with the age of the person. The same thing, if you were talking to someone you knew as a child, you know, the way you would speak to them would be different than even if you were talking to someone of your same age who's a complete stranger. There's a very different way of communicating. So when we talk about communication, and the argument for prayer is that it is ultimately a conversation with God. That is the definition of prayer everywhere. It is a conversation with God. And it's the nature of a conversation. The conversation is governed by the age of the conversers and the amount of time they have had over a period of time to converse. So having said that, the second thing I'd like to tell you is sort of, I've explained to you before that my family is Native American. In Native American families, the passage of religion is always entrusted to the matriarch. That is the oldest living female in the group. That's her job. So in my case, it was my grandmother. And one of the interesting things about prayer is my grandmother said that what you need to do is to understand and accept the fact that prayer is a conversation with God. And she told me most people don't accept that. Most people see prayer as a one-way thing. But she says you must understand it as a conversation. And if you understand it as a conversation, one of the things you're going to do is watch the way you converse with people. Every one of us here unconsciously is in an endless process of adjusting the way we converse with people. And that's because of what works and what doesn't. You know, does someone misunderstand this? Then I need to find a better way to say it. But you will go through your life getting better and better at conversation with the people you're conversing with. Now, having said that, just a couple of things. My grandmother told me, and I could go through a whole list of things, but one of the things she told me is that if you are around a person whom every time you speak to them they're asking you for something, you will eventually avoid them. And she says you do not want God avoiding you. Okay? You know, the last thing you want to do is kneel down and pray and have God say, "Oh no, it's him again." You know. So I'd also like you to know that when you look at little children and study language, the very reason children learn language is because they want things. Okay? Children learn to talk so they can get what they want. Okay? Well, so you should always expect the beginning of prayer to in fact be petitions. Okay? But that isn't where prayer should stay. And for a remarkable number of people, prayer stays at petitions. They just are endlessly asking for things. A couple more things about the prayer. In this coming before God in prayer is to try to the best of your ability to learn from your conversations about what goes on and how you can improve the whole thing of prayer. Another thing to point out is at Mission San Luis Obispo, we do a children's mass probably once a week. And I had trouble remembering because I don't do it every week. But I think it's at the church every week. I got it probably about every second week. And when we do it, one of the most interesting things to me is to watch the congregation just as a thing of prayer. At the end of the Mass, there'll be a number of older people who will stay and pray for a while at the end of Mass. No child will be in church 1 second longer than is absolutely necessary. Okay? So when it's over, by God, it's over. And they're out, you know. But older people will pray. Another thing that goes on, the people in San Luis Obispo in the mission school have taught the children sign language. And so one of the things the kids do during the liturgy is any of the responses they do in sign language while they're speaking them. But the advantage of that is the kids love doing the thing. And you can look at the youngest kids there are so enthusiastic. Incidentally, Alleluia is this. I love that one. Okay. So anyway, you watch the kids go through this, and you can actually watch the kids in first grade. It's wonderful. Second grade, it's great. Third grade, it's great. About fifth grade, it's kind of embarrassing to do that in front of a kid. And so one of the things to know about children, and this is very important for parents to know, children need to move. Okay, whether it's moving their hands or walking or whatever, but children need to move. And the thing that children really hate about prayer is you're supposed to sit there and pray. It's not the prayer that bothers them. It's the movement. And again, with Native American prayers, they all involve movement. Now, again, in Native American prayer, you can be involved in the movement or sit at the side. You can do either one. But there is no prayer that there isn't movement. And the idea is if you're more comfortable moving, then you move in the prayer. And if you're more comfortable sitting, then you sit in the prayer. Another experience I had with regards to Native American prayer, it has to do with this requesting. My family's, the tribal areas are in Montana and Manitoba. But anyway, there was a drought in Alberta, and I want you to know that a drought in Alberta is if you go a week without rain. One of the things in Alberta, I was up there one time when they had actually 2 months without rain, and do you know that there were cracks opened in the ground about 2 and 3 feet? You had to really watch them because they have no watering systems, and so the ground totally dries out. It's because they get rain all the time. So anyway, Alberta, they had this drought. I don't know how long it was going on, but the farmers were getting nervous. Alberta is wheat country. They raise wheat there. So they had this Native American thing, and so we're all gathered there. That was the first group experience I had of Native American prayer. I was there with my grandmother, and we're there, and people are, spontaneous prayers, people going through different prayers. I knew why we were there. I knew it was a drought, and I knew we were praying for rain. And I was getting more and more frustrated as it was going on, because not a single person ever asked for rain. And I knew deep in my heart, until someone asked for rain, we weren't going to get to the cookies. I knew that, okay? I know how religion works. So I was getting more and more frustrated. And the prayer went on for 2 hours, and not a single person asked for rain. Do you know what everyone did? One by one, people would get up and account thanksgiving to God for something that occurs on the face of the earth when it's kissed by rain. It says, like for instance here, they would say the poppies that grow are just fantastic when rain comes upon the ground. But the entire thing was a thanksgiving. And yet if you had an ounce of sense listening to it, you knew they were asking for rain. Okay? And so their way is not always to approach kind of with this kind of thing. So first of all, with petitions. Petition is where prayer begins. And initially people just ask for things. And I want you to know that through your whole life you're going to ask for things. It isn't a matter of you stop asking for things. Again, a baby, the first thing that prompts a baby to learn to speak is to get something they want. That's why a baby begins to speak, usually with regards to food or comfort. But anyway, that's why a baby begins to speak. Now, obviously, language is a much more important thing in an older person's life. However, you will still occasionally hear, please pass the potatoes, okay? So, as a matter of fact, the idea of petition never really goes away. It's just that shouldn't dominate your prayer any more than it dominates your conversation today. And it shouldn't be eliminated any more than it's eliminated. The other side of this, and I'll mention it even as we go through this, you really can't make a mistake in prayer. Like if you're standing before God praying and there's something you really want to ask him for, but you're too polite to really, you have to know he knows what you're thinking anyway. Go ahead and ask, okay? But what you should do is that watch your prayer over a period of time should actually become less and less motion and less petition. Those two things you want to watch in your prayer, and not so much that you need to make less petition and make less movement. You just need to watch to see that, because that will tell how your prayer is advancing, okay? If my prayer is nothing but petition, then my prayer really isn't advancing very much, okay? So this idea of petition. The next stage of prayer, people move from petition to meditation. And meditation, meditation doesn't need to be private or alone. Meditation has to do with how engaged your mind is. An example would be, if you were to take, let's take me serving Mass. In second grade, as soon as you made First Communion, you were allowed to serve Mass. And when I began serving Mass, it was entirely in Latin. So I could say everything. I could say it all perfectly. I had no idea what was going on. I knew nothing of the Latin. So I would do all of this. Well, at the beginning of prayer, most people learn prayers. I don't know how common this is in non-Catholic circles, but in Roman Catholic circles, you learn, the Our Father, the Creed. We learn these prayers, and initially a child thinks that's praying, okay? But that's just recitation. Okay? And I guess a good example would be the Hail Mary. We all memorize the Hail Mary. We could go through the Hail Mary and all this sort of thing. But as you begin to grow and understand, like the Rosary, for instance, you understand there are mysteries you're meditating on while you say the Rosary. That doesn't mean that you stop saying the Rosary, but it means, as a matter of fact, there's more to it. There's another thing to it. So one of the things that you want to, and this is a conscious development, meditation is a conscious inclusion in prayer. So as the prayer goes on, you begin to more and more engage your mind. And to the degree you can more and more engage your mind, the prayer becomes enriched. And I'd like to give you two examples of meditation. In honor of the Pope, I'll give you the Ignatian method first. The Ignatian method was developed by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And one of the great advantages of the Ignatian method, it's one of the sure ways to have God speak to you. And remember I told you, the key to prayer is not praying. The key to prayer is listening. The reason for that is you have no idea what God wants to say, but you actually know everything you want to say, and He knows everything you want to say. So the fact of the matter is, the key is to listen. The key has nothing to do with the words, okay? So we just watch the words. Anyway, in the Ignatian method, what you do is study a Bible story. I will take as an example where Jesus calls Simon Peter. If you remember, they were out fishing. They didn't catch anything. He tells them to throw the nets out a certain way. They get this great catch of fish. They come into the shore, and Jesus is there and calls Simon Peter. Simon Peter's response is, "Depart from me, I'm a sinner." And Jesus completely ignores that, because it's true. You can't argue with it. So Jesus ignores that and simply says, "I will make you a fisher of people." Okay? And anyway, in the Ignatian method, you would read that story. Once you read the story, it's best to read the story the night before you're going to do the meditation, and read it a couple of times. When you get up in the morning, or when you decide to do your meditation, some people are morning people, some people are evening people. One of the things they tell you, if you want to be successful in prayer, find out whether you're a morning person, an evening person, or when, and give the best time to God. Whatever is the best time. A person who does best in school is the person who knows that, knows when to study. Don't waste your time studying in the morning if you're an afternoon person. It won't work. Don't waste your time studying in the afternoon if you're a morning person. But the standard thing of all students is you study in the morning and you have beer and pizza in the evening, okay? And that's one of the reasons why morning people oftentimes do better in school, because everyone thinks you're supposed to study then. skip it. Have pizza for breakfast, study in the evening, if that's the way you want to do it, okay? But anyway, you figure out what's your best time. And what you do is go through the scene and go through it in your mind. The key to this, incidentally, is imagination. So when you go through this, you want to go to a place that isn't going to be distracting to you. You want to close your eyes and you want to set the scene. Imagine the Sea of Galilee. Imagine the boat out there. The more detail you can put into it, the more successful this is. You look at the condition of the water and all this at the end of the whole thing, and you go through the whole scene and you play it right up to where Jesus says, I will make you a fisher of men. And then you have Jesus turn to you and find out what he would say to you. And you will be surprised how often that works. It is a remarkable way to meditate. And St. Ignatius taught that as the Jesuit form of meditation. There are a number of ways that you can, in your mind, set scenes. They don't even need to be in the Bible. People have great devotions to, let's say, what's this? Divine Mercy. Okay, the image of Divine Mercy is a very common picture. Now, someone could somehow set the scene, set the whole thing up, put yourself in the position, what would he say to you, and this sort of thing. But that's an excellent way to meditate, is to go through it in that kind of way. Another way of meditation, and this again is very common in seminaries, particularly non-Jesuit seminaries. This would probably, the Ignatian is mandatory in the Jesuit seminaries. This other one, there are a lot of options, but the second one I'm going to give you is probably the most common in non-Jesuit seminaries. And it's a method of prayer where you use a book. And what you do is you take, you could take, well, let's say you take the Bible, but you actually could take any book. And it's been my experience, it doesn't even need to be a spiritual book. You know, that you can take books that are of their nature inspiring, you know. But anyway, what you do is you read it in a very slow fashion and read something, allow your mind to play with it. When your mind gets exhausted and begins to be distracted, then you go on to a little more of the reading. But the key thing to know of all of that is not your reading, but what your mind's doing between your times of reading. And the purpose of the reading is to keep you away from distractions, to keep you focused. Okay? Now, as you get on, you enter into a time that is basically called contemplation. And contemplation is a time when you stand before God or sit before God and allow thoughts to really flow. A lot of this really comes from things like you've read in the past or things you've heard. And I'll tell you what occurs most frequently with me is music. Because music somehow, you know, tricks, and so music goes in. And I've had a very good training with this. I think I've told you about that nun, the Immaculate Heart nun, who did all that artwork using advertisements. So I'll tell you, one of the things that has become a very strong thing of contemplation with me of late is actually the commercial for the Lexus, the relentless pursuit of perfection. That is their thing, you know, and this idea that they do that very much in their ads, that pursuing perfection is not an easy thing, it's not a part-time thing, and they go, and that can say volumes about the religious life. Like, is my pursuit of perfection equal to my pursuit of understanding Scripture? You know, because one day God's going to instantaneously give me all of this. But perfection I have to work on to get to him, you know. I'm not going to instantaneously have that dumped on me at any point. So the idea is to be able, whether it's music, whether it's something you've read in the past, but just to allow thoughts to flow. And you don't, in this particular kind of meditation, edit thoughts. What you do is refer them to God. Like, for instance, suppose you're beginning a beautiful meditation on the, you know, pursuit of perfection, and you suddenly are really distracted by the fact that you aren't really sure that today, which is Sunday, your kids are going to be going to church. because they're, somewhere else today. And that thought just keeps nagging you. Will they be going to church today? Well, in contemplation, the presumption is that's what God wants to talk to you about. Why am I so excited about whether or not they go to church? Why am I, this whole thing. And allow God to speak to you of that. In the tradition that I come from, Native American tradition, there is no such thing as a distraction in prayer. What normal people call a distraction is God's effort to change the subject. Okay? So what he's doing, remember it's a conversation. And if you've never heard this before, it is not possible to have a distraction in a conversation. If you and I are having a talk and suddenly that window over there were to explode, it wouldn't be a distraction. We'd end up talking about the window. Okay? But it would not take us away from the conversation. Okay? So understand that what God is trying to do oftentimes is to direct our minds to things either he wants to talk about or he knows we really want to talk about as part of ourselves. All that's called contemplation. The last, and what they call the highest level, is what's called mysticism. Okay? Now, mysticism, if I could use the example, let me give you the quote from Teresa of Lisieux. Teresa of Lisieux, they asked her about prayer, because she had a very highly mystical life and a very close relationship with God. And so they're asking Teresa of Lisieux, she used to pray in the church for hours. They say, well, what do you do in prayer? And she says, well, I just sit there and I look at God and he looks at me. That's mysticism. Mysticism does not really have content. Okay? There isn't a set thing. Now, I'd like you to notice that in these levels, we would say, well, mysticism's the highest prayer, that's what I've got to do. Well, the fact of the matter is, you can't at the beginning of prayer decide you're going to sit in God's presence absolutely silent and think anything's going to happen. Okay? The only thing you'll do is smell the coffee being made in the other room. That's about it, So what you need to do is to begin to work through the prayer. Understand everyone's prayer begins with petitions, and what you want to do is learn ways of listening to God. Meditation is a way of listening to God. Contemplation is a way of listening to God. This mysticism are ways of listening to God. And what you want to do is integrate more and more into your prayer the listening to God. And I will remind you of what I said. We had I think one of these whole things was on prayer one time. But one of the things to know, if you've never done it, it's a wonderful exercise, is in the morning, present God a prayer. It can be any kind of prayer, but understand it as one side of a conversation, okay? And whether you're asking for advice or something or whatever, present your side of the prayer and place in your mind the fact that God will speak to you during the day. And at the end of the day, just take some time alone and allow yourself to go through your day. You will be surprised. At the beginning, it's kind of slow, but eventually you will find that there's something that takes place or is said or something that deals with what you were talking about, and that will happen every day. And the more advanced you get into it, the more you'll realize there are lots of things said about it from different, and that God was speaking to you basically all day. At that point, that's where contemplation becomes very, very good. Where contemplation is a matter of allowing your mind to go, that then it picks up on these things. And I had to go to XXX. What was God actually saying to me there? Why? And I've shared with you several times, but I'll share with you the first time that this actually happened to me, and it was a life-changing event for me, to be honest, with regards to prayer, is that when I was in the seminary in Canada, the seminary was very, very French. And if you go into another culture, it's much easier to learn the language than the culture. And so I had great difficulty with French culture. And just one area of theology. When the French compose theology, they're more concerned that it sounds good than it is correct. Okay, so the French will choose a much more beautiful word that might not be, and not that they're wrong, but it isn't quite as exact. Whereas we in the United States write theology like a guidebook. We're very, look to the left, 2 feet. There's a tree over there, and that's how our theology is. And so it was very difficult for me to deal with that. And so I kind of decided I was going to have to make a decision whether I was going to do the next 2 years of theology in Canada or not. And I was in Canada during the administration of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when Quebec was looking for the possibility of independence, and I was living in Quebec. No one would speak English on a bet. Okay, you did not speak English. It simply wasn't done. And we went to a cabaret every night for wine and cheese after class. And so we'd go there, and there were folk singers who sang in French, and there's lots of wonderful French folk songs. But anyway, we went through all this. Only once, all the time I was there, did they ever sing anything in English. They sang one chorus of one song in English. And the song, incidentally, is a French song. And they were singing it in French, but they sang only one, and it was that one day when I had decided I was going to work out what I was doing. And the verse they sang is, if you go away, if you go away, if you go away. But if you stay, I will make you a day like no day has been, nor will be again. But if you go away, if you go away, if you go away. It was very obvious. It was very, very clear. I'm not that dumb, So it's just very clear. But I have found over a period of my life that when I have difficulties and everything, in prayer, I really lay them out before God. I don't tell him how to resolve it. I just sort of lay out, this is the problem. And then I watch during the day. And sometimes it's so obvious that you don't have to wait till the night to think about it. But oftentimes, in the evening, just begin to think, what is God indicating to me about this? You'll find it's very, very successful. Okay? So eventually you reach the point, like Teresa of Avila, Teresa of Lisieux rather, I think Avila too, but I was using Teresa of Lisieux as the thing. You simply stay in the presence of God. Now, one of the things that's very interesting to me about this is that you notice this in conversations, like with people. I think I told you that my great-grandparents were married many years, beyond 60 years. And one of the most interesting things to me, the high point of their day, their home was about 2 blocks away from Lake Winnipeg, up on the Native American reservation called Fort Garry. And so what they used to do in the evening, and it was ritualized, absolutely ritualized. It was before dinner. The two of them, normally about 3 o'clock, they would walk over and they'd take a short walk on the edge of the lake, and then they sat down at this bench and they just sat there. And they would sit there for an hour and a half, just sitting there. They did not talk or anything. They were just in one another's presence, watch the ducks or whatever. You very seldom saw them talk, and no one was allowed to go with them. The grandkids, we were enraged at the beginning, but we simply were not allowed. That was, and it wasn't as though they had something to say they didn't want the kids to hear or anything. It's that they had reached the point where what they did was experience one another's presence. Now, you and I want to reach that state in God. We want to reach the state in the presence of God, that the most wonderful thing about God is that he's sitting here with me. And that the greatest thing I have to offer to God is that I'm sitting here with him. That's where we want to go. But prayer, you have to go through the stages, If 2 people have just met, sit at the bench and don't talk to one another, I'll tell you they're mad at one another. Okay, that's what that means at that point. So this is the sort of thing that you and I want to go through. But prayer will gradually change. The main thing it changes with regards to the age of the individual has to do with activity. The younger person is, the more activity needs to be involved. And if you're uncomfortable praying seated, don't pray seated. If you're more comfortable walking, walk. If you're more comfortable moving, move. And you would find the same way. Like I look back at friends. When I have talks with friends today, they're usually over meals or something, or just sitting in the living room or something like that. When I was in the seminary, every time we would have a serious talk with someone, we'd go out and walk. And we'd talk while we're walking. It's just a human thing The younger you are, the more activity must be involved in a conversation, physical activity. And the older you are, the less. So apply that to prayer. The second thing is, the more a couple or anyone has conversed with one another, the more is communicated by silence. The short time, that's like what do you call it? The courtship. Oftentimes the courtship in a couple, there's just endless information being passed because they don't really know one another about their past, and there's all this kinds of information. Well, as a couple gets older, oftentimes there isn't that much information being passed, and certainly not that much information about one another. There's information about the things they're doing and stuff like that. But the fact is, there is less and less verbiage, and actually a more and more powerful communication. And so that's what we seek with God. I would like one day to stand before God in absolute silence and have the highest level of prayer in His presence. That's what we're aiming for. The endless pursuit of perfection. That's where we're headed, okay? Now, I'd like to, we'll be open to some prayers about this, some questions about this later. I'd like to talk a little bit now about apologetics, because that was one of the topics. I'd like you to know there has been a radical change in apologetics in the Catholic Church in the past, I guess, probably 40, 50 years. And the radical change in apologetics is that when if you go back historically, the great apologists like St. Justin and stuff like that, they actually geared the arguments of Christianity to non-Christians to try and win them. Now, I told you the first time that no longer works. That is not the way things go anymore. If you really want to study apologetics today, do you know what you study? You study autobiographies. If you were to take something like Cardinal Newman, The Path to Rome, or that Presbyterian minister, Scott Hahn, you take, Rome, Sweet Home? But those are the books of apologetics today. It isn't so much an arguing for the faith. A good book of apologetics today, a person reveals the process by which they came in, rather than argues the thing. And so you really see that. What we have gone with in the church today is the Augustinian definition. St. Augustine defines theology as faith seeking an explanation. And the key to that, in St. Augustine's talking about it, is that if you don't have faith, then the explanation isn't going to mean anything. But he says what you need to do is to draw people into faith. And once they come into faith, they have this explanation. If you've never heard it before, that's the very reason why St. Augustine founded a community. Incidentally, the community we know as the Augustinians was not founded by Augustine. The community known as the Augustinians was founded by a pope using St. Augustine's rule much later. But St. Augustine, when the community he formed, in order to be a part of the community, you had to be a friend in the community. It was a community of friends. And the reason he formed it is he didn't want to waste time on people who weren't members of the church. Because what he wanted to do was seek the explanations for what everyone believed. He didn't want to bring people into belief. He didn't have time for that. He says, I believe, I want to understand all this. So in his mind, apologetics, as you would see, for Augustine, was this idea of, I know that Jesus saves me. Why does he save me? How does he save me? How do I know that he saves me? This is what he goes through. So apologetics is seen that way. What we have found today is that the new way of conversion, or the new way of evangelism, is this serious kind of witness, like very dramatically in Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, without ever preaching a sermon, won far more converts than all kinds of people. I like the big thing in England when I was a youngster in Hyde Park. There was a set thing where a Catholic would stand on the soapbox and would talk about Catholicism and would answer questions. And people would do that with regards to different religions. And a lot of people were won that way. at that time. A lot of people were won that way, but that doesn't seem to work now. So the big thing is to live Christianity in such a powerful way, you draw people into it. As they come into it, then apologetics becomes a big thing. I need to know the explanations. One of the things that Simon Peter will tell people in his, in his letter, I don't know whether it's the first or the second, he says that you must have reasons for the faith that is within you. And that's connected to this witnessing. That, you live a powerful life, and then people ask you why, and it's the explanation of the life. It begins with the life. You've heard that story of Mother Teresa many times about that interview with the young man who wanted to interview her for the BBC, and she wouldn't take time out of her work to go to the interview, but he was welcome to interview her while she was working, and what she was doing at the particular time was bathing lepers. So he stood there while she was bathing lepers and interviewed her, asked questions. When they got all finished, the camera was off, but the microphone was not. And he said to Mother Teresa, he said, "I wouldn't do that for $1 million. And her response, "Neither would I." The fact of the matter is, that's not why she did it, okay? But do you realize that that is the opportunity to witness? That is the apologetic moment. The apologetic moment, why would you do this? And it's very clear in Mother Teresa's writings. Mother Teresa says, everyone will do this when you realize what God has done for you. You realize that, you'll do this, okay? But you need to realize that first. And so what we see is that this kind of witness is what draws people into the faith. And what we used to do in the past with apologetics to try and train people in the faith, today apologetics is used within the church so that people will understand what they believe, so that they have the explanation when someone asks them. But we don't teach the apologetics. We witness and learn the apologetics, okay? A couple of things about this. One of the real difficulties that has happened in the church, and this is a result of Vatican II. One of the difficulties in times of change is that oftentimes things run amok. And one of the things that ran amok in the Vatican Council is that we were very convinced during the Vatican Council that the way that you and I had learned religion was not correct. And they would still agree with that in the pedagogy of religion. That the way I learned religion is, why did God create you? God created me to know Him, love Him, and serve Him in this life so I could be happy with Him in the next. I have the Baltimore Catechism answers down verbatim. I swear if I get asked a question at Last Judgment, I'll probably give a catechism answer, because they're very ingrained in me. And I'll tell you, just as a joke, it's a fact, when I was in the seminary, when we get questions in the seminary on tests, theological questions, I had to militate in my heart against simply writing the catechism answer, which would never have gotten me out of there, but I knew it better than all the other stuff, But anyway, in the Vatican Council, they understood that the way religion was taught to us was not the correct way to teach religion now. And so, but they didn't replace it with anything. And so what happened, we have an entire generation in the Catholic Church who spent all of religious ed drawing pictures and pasting things, who know nothing of the church. Flat out nothing. And it's little wonder that their children don't know anything. I mean, they have no way to pass it on, and they don't see the importance of going to religious ed, because for them, religious ed is pasting things on paper, which, admittedly, that was a mistake we made. And so we're trying to pull out of that. And I think we have amazing religious ed programs today. There are a lot of very good religious ed programs, and a bunch of them. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of people who will not send their kids to religious ed, who claim to be Catholic, and who, but there's virtually no understanding. But that's one of the reasons why the popes, the preceding pope, and I would be willing to bet this man, particularly allowing where he's from, South America, one of the great focus will be evangelization. because we have a huge number of people who claim to be Catholic and don't know any more about it than an Aborigine in some jungle. Know nothing at all about what it is to be Catholic. And that's the thing of apologetics, is we need to win the person by this evangelism of witnessing. And having brought them, we need to be able then to explain what they already believe. But the key in apologetics, when I was first in the seminary, was seen as a way of winning people. It is not today. But it is a way of educating people for what they already believe. And, I could just give you maybe one example. If we were to take something like the Rosary, if you're really interested in what the Rosary is, what I was told as a youngster was the Virgin Mary appeared to Saint Dominic and gave Dominic the Rosary, the Dominican Rosary as we have. I'll tell you where the Rosary actually came from. The Rosary came from the fact that priests used to say the Divine Office. Actually, we still say the Divine Office, and it's divided into the Psalms for a week. There were now 150 Psalms, and people wanted to be involved in the breviary with the priests, and they could not do it largely because they couldn't read. And if you could read, you'd be lucky to afford a book. So they really couldn't be involved in it. So what they started doing at the monasteries was putting bells in the monastery. The bell would tell you when the time came to say the office. And you knew how many of the Psalms were said at that time. And you would say that many Hail Marys. There are 150 beads on the Rosary. And then in an effort to make it easy to manage the beads, they're divided every 10 beads by another bead, okay? And the popes were so impressed with this, they said that the same indulgence that's connected to the breviary should be connected to the Rosary, because that was the way people said. And at that point, they added those things on the beginning, the Our Father, 3 Hail Marys, Gloria, and the Creed. Those prayers have to be said for the intentions of the Holy Father in order to get the indulgence connected with the Rosary. You always have to pray for the Pope's intentions in order to get an indulgence. And you could say actually any prayer, but that's how they were put on. Then how did the Rosary get popular? Well, the Rosary, again, remember the Dominicans are an order that say the office. So that was their way of praying, and they distributed the Rosary to people who worked at their places and could not say the Rosary. So what happened was we elected a Dominican Pope. It's not unusual for religious to be elected Pope. As you know, the one we just elected is a Jesuit. Okay? So it's not unusual. We have 2 things from the man who was elected the Dominican Pope. The first is he refused to stop wearing his habit. And since that time, all the popes have worn white. The Dominican habit is white. But he was the first Pope to wear white. All popes have worn white since then. And the second thing was we were having an invasion from the Muslims at the time. And the Muslims put together a fleet to invade Rome. And the Pope tried to get people to defend Rome against this fleet that was coming in to destroy Rome, the Muslim fleet. Everyone knew how powerful the Muslims were. No one in their right mind would help him. And you had to have, a royal person. So an illegitimate son of the King of Spain, who is well known for other reasons, Don Juan of Austria. But Don Juan volunteered to help the Pope, and he volunteered to put together a fleet. Now, everyone knew it was a rotten fleet. He was going to be defeated, and again, naval procedures are not Don Juan's forte. Okay, having said that, so we had this whole thing set up. So what the Pope did, the Pope asked everyone in the church to say the Rosary, by which he meant the Dominican Rosary. And so everyone said it. The Muslim fleet was completely defeated in the same way the Armada that went to England. It was a storm. Okay, a storm confused the ships. They were firing on one another, and Don Juan, with great sense, stayed out of the whole thing and watched it from. And once the Muslim fleet had destroyed themselves, he came back victorious. Okay, he And the day the news reached Rome, the Pope declared the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, Lady of the Holy Rosary. And so the feast and the Rosary and everything are all connected with that. Now, why do I say the Rosary? I say the Rosary because it's one of the prayers my mother taught me. And so it's one of the ways I remember my mother when I say the Rosary. And I've found personally, if I'm sick or something like that, it's difficult reading, the Rosary is an easy way to pray. Okay? So if someone wants to know about the Rosary, I can tell them why I say it, but I also know apologetically where the Rosary came from. You know? And what you want to do as a believer, and don't just let someone tell you about things, you need to make sure, because I think you can get an awful lot of misinformation. I think the society in which we live in, its subtitle is Wikipedia. Okay? Anyone can make up anything and try and explain things. And so you never want to do that. You want to really find out what things are. But the new apologetics today is we win people by the witnessing, and then we be able to explain to them, but you don't want to explain more than they believe. Like someone who believes in God needs to know that God is good and caring and loving. Someone who believes that God is Trinity needs to know how that developed in the church and why we understand that and how that works. And so that they're very complicated doctrines and everything, but the idea is you must believe it before you explain it. There's no reason, the explanation isn't helpful until someone already believes it. Okay?